The Trojan War is a pivotal moment in Greek mythology, both within the lore and history of that mythology, as well as for the culture that developed and maintained it. The story was the culmination of the lives of many of the great heroic figures in myth, a focus point for creativity and imagination, and the impetus for many of the most significant stories ever told. While the story may have had humble origins in a historical conflict between rival Aegean civilizations, it quickly outgrew any foundation in fact to become the most complex and significant event in ancient fiction. The story then expanded and swelled over time as the events leading up to and following on from the war became sagas in their own rights, and every possible angle of the events was explored. These even crossed genres of literature, from epic poetry to tragedy and even philosophy. The Trojan War dominated Greek thought and art. Vases, statues, paintings, and more would capture myriad moments from this conflict to immortalize them to this very day. Since the story was so widely known to them, the ancient Greeks would already be familiar with the characters and events when engaging with all these different works of art and literature. For modern audiences, however, there's a lot to unpack that doesn't come to us naturally. So for our purposes, we're going to look at all the important things you need to know about the Trojan War, so that you can read works like the Iliad and the Odyssey, or the Trojan Women, with a handy grasp on the context. We'll start at the beginning of sorts, and trace it through to the aftermath. But keep in mind that at all times we're barely scraping the surface of a rich world populated with hundreds of characters and stories of their own. And that's just based on the ones that still survive today. It may surprise you to know that the event that really kicked off the whole Trojan War was a wedding. As strange as it may sound, this wedding preceded the war by many years, but set in motion a course of events that would inevitably bring two giant civilizations to bitter conflict. This was the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, two characters you may not have heard of before. Now Peleus was a mighty warrior and the son of the king of Aegina. Thetis, however, was a Nereid, a sea nymph of great beauty, who had naturally caught the eye of Zeus. However, a prophecy revealed to Zeus that she would have a son who would grow up to be greater than his father. And if you know anything about how Zeus came to power, you'd know he comes from a long line of sons who overthrew their own father. Therefore, in order to ensure this prophesied son would not compete with the Olympians, Zeus had Thetis marry the mortal Peleus. A grand wedding followed, and all the gods were invited, except for one. Much like that drunk uncle that gets left off your guest list for the reception, Eris, the goddess of strife and discord, was likewise not welcome at this feast of the gods. Perhaps they should have considered that the only thing worse than inviting her was not doing so. Whatever the case, Eris still turned up, and in a stunning display of petty revenge, she arrived with a simple gift. A golden apple with a single phrase inscribed upon it, "For the fairest." Now, with a pantheon of powerful and egotistical goddesses in attendance, there was absolutely no way that this would not cause the havoc that it intended. You could just picture the scene, as the three most powerful goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, all reach for the apple at the same time, meeting each other's gaze with a tense smile and a nervous laugh. This was going to be a problem. Zeus was immediately called upon to judge which of these three goddesses was truly the fairest. Knowing that choosing one would upset the other two, Zeus wisely decided to recuse himself from the entire process. Instead, he selected an unlikely mortal to do the judging, a young herdsman named Paris. Now, Paris had gained a reputation for fairness and being a good judge, but not in the way you might expect. You see, as a herdsman, he oversaw livestock competitions, and he had a prize bull which was pretty good. But when Ares decided to enter the competition, disguised as a bull of course, Paris selflessly awarded the prize to him over his own animal. So, naturally this made him the perfect judge for a divine beauty contest? More realistically though, I'm sure Zeus was just happy to pin the problem on any mortal, so he didn't have to deal with it. Whatever the reason, Hermes arrived as Paris's guide, and the three goddesses came to him, and each made him an offer. A bribe, if you will. Hera offered him power, the chance to become king over all of Europe. Athena offered wisdom and the ability to win any war. While Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. And Paris, being a red-blooded male, did the obvious thing and went with the pretty girl. Never mind that he probably could have had all the women he wanted with power or victory, but oh well. This all would have ended well if it were not for the fact that this very woman, Helen, was already married to the king of Sparta, Menelaus. Things were complicated further since Paris was no regular herdsman, but rather the son of King Priam of Troy, abandoned as a child. As is too often the case in mythology, there was a prophecy that the child born on his birthday would lead to Troy's destruction. And, well, that one came true, didn't it? His mother couldn't bring herself to dispose of him, so instead she tasked a herdsman with the job. But after he abandoned the baby, he was astonished to find that young Paris returned a few weeks later, supposedly suckled by a she-bear. Eat your heart out, Romulus and Remus. Paris was raised by this herdsman, but eventually he discovered his true identity as a Trojan prince, and he was welcomed home by his father, King Priam. So, Aphrodite had promised Helen to Paris, but she was surprisingly frugal on the details of how. Sometime later, however, Paris travelled to Sparta to see Helen and to bring her home. How exactly he achieved this is different in nearly every telling. Some say that Paris forcibly abducted her. Others say that she fell in love with the handsome prince and came willingly. Some say Aphrodite controlled the whole thing, while others even go as far as to say that Helen never went to Troy, but instead was in Egypt the whole time. It was only a facsimile, her eidolon, that went with Paris. Whatever the case, Paris soon returned to Troy with the beautiful Helen in tow and set in motion the events that would bring war to his doorstep. Soon after, Menelaus returned home to find that his wife was gone and Paris was the culprit. Now anyone would be enraged to find out that their wife had run off with another man, but Menelaus was no ordinary man. Not only was he the king of Sparta, but his brother Agamemnon was the king of Mycenae and the preeminent king among all the Greeks. And just to further complicate matters, when Helen had been an eligible young lady, all of her prospective suitors had sworn an oath that they would defend the marriage of the winner. So when Menelaus came calling, all the great heroes of Greece were honor bound to help him. And so the pieces began to assemble on the board. There were quite a few adventures and misadventures that took place while the Greek forces gathered for an assault upon Troy. Odysseus tried to avoid the war by pretending to be crazy, ploughing the seashore like a madman. His ruse was defeated, however, when his infant son was put in the way of his plough and he swerved to avoid harming him. Also by this time, Peleus and Thetis had now had their prophesied son, none other than the legendary Achilles. Thetis attempted to hide him from the war by dressing him as a girl, knowing there was every chance he would die a tragic but glorious death in the conflict. He too was betrayed, however, when Odysseus faked an attack and the young warrior immediately reached for his weapons. Eventually, the Greek forces managed to assemble at a place called Aulis, after several years and a few aborted attempts. But the crossing was seemingly stifled by the lack of any wind for the fleet. In desperate need for an answer, Agamemnon turned to Calchas, the Greeks' resident prophet, who informed him that Agamemnon had majorly annoyed the goddess Artemis, and the only solution was to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. After initially refusing, Agamemnon went through with the ritual, much to the great and lingering anger of his wife Clytemnestra. However, some versions of the tale have him replacing her with a deer, or they say that she was switched out at the last second by Artemis herself, allowing Iphigenia to become a priestess, or even the goddess Hecate. Whatever the case, the winds returned and the Greek fleet of 1,000 ships sailed across the Aegean towards the Trojan shores. When the Greeks finally reached Asia Minor, there were still many challenges to face. None more so than the prophecy which said that the first person to step on land would also be the first to die. Odysseus, ever eager to gain honor, jumped out first, but sneakily landed on his shield, so he didn't technically step onto the land. This deceived another Greek, Protesilaus, into thinking the coast was clear, but when he stepped off, he truly became the first to step on Trojan soil, and soon after, he would die at the hands of Hector, first among many. A brief battle was fought for the beach, but the Greeks eventually won the day and the Trojans retreated inside their huge, fortified and well-provisioned city. Any chance of a quick victory in the conflict evaporated on the spot. 9 long years of siege followed, most of which are skipped over in myth, since it's only in the 10th year that Homer's Iliad takes place. On top of this, we know that much of the Greek force didn't stay for the full 10 years, so there isn't really too much to say about that intervening period. Instead, we'll skip right to the events that kicked off one of the greatest stories ever told. The catalyst for the events of the Iliad was the capture of a young woman named Chryseis, who was then given to Agamemnon as his prize. Her father, Chryses, a priest of Apollo, came to beg for her safe return, but was rebuffed and insulted by Agamemnon. In retribution, Apollo sent a plague upon the Greek camp, and Agamemnon was forced by the other Greeks to return Chryseis. The haughty king was none too happy to give up his prize, so he himself took Achilles' own prize, a woman named Briseis, as compensation. Achilles was therefore enraged by the slight, going so far as to nearly kill Agamemnon if it hadn't been for the swift intervention of Athena. Instead, Achilles vowed that he would never fight for the Greeks again and withdrew his Myrmidons from battle. The rage of Achilles is the subject of the Iliad from beginning to end, and all the disastrous consequences that flow from it. Shortly after this explosive opening, a duel was organized between Menelaus and Paris to settle the conflict. But when Paris was on the brink of defeat, he was whisked away by his fairy godmother Aphrodite, and the fighting began all over again. Without Achilles, the Trojans pushed the Greeks back to the shoreline, with Hector on the verge of setting fire to their very ships. With the Greek forces on the ropes, it seemed that only one man could save them, Achilles. No, wait, Patroclus. Achilles' beloved companion Patroclus decided that he could not endure sitting by and watching the other Greeks be destroyed. He rode out into battle wearing Achilles' armor to inspire the weary Greeks with the hope that Achilles had returned to the fray. His arrival changed the tides of the battle, and the Trojans were pushed back and put into flight. But the glory and battle lust overtook Patroclus. He rode too far in pursuit of Hector and was betrayed by fate. Hector, believing that he was fighting Achilles, killed Patroclus, only to later discover his true identity, something that he instantly regretted. The Greeks quickly rallied to retrieve Patroclus's body, but Hector had already taken Achilles' famous armor from him before his comrades could reach him. When news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles, his rage and grief entwined into a dramatic escalation. First, taking the time to mourn his beloved companion, Achilles swore vengeance on Hector and rejoined the fray. Kitted out in new armor made by Hephaestus, Achilles cut a swathe through the Trojans, even fighting a river god on his way to reach Hector. The valiant defender of Troy stood firm when all others fled, but even his indomitable spirit broke when faced with the rage of the son of Peleus. He ran, chased by Achilles around the walls 3 times before making a final stand. A fierce, climactic duel ensued, but Achilles, knowing the weakness of his own armor which Hector was wearing, landed the killing blow with his spear and laid Hector low. His rage yet unsated, Achilles proceeded to drag Hector's corpse around the walls of Troy for days. Eventually, King Priam came under cover of night to Achilles' tent to beg for the return of his son's body. Achilles, overcome by the pathos of a mighty king begging just for the chance to bury his son, and thinking of his own poor father, relented and returned Hector's body, allowing him to be buried. The anger of Achilles finally dissipated, and the Iliad draws to a close at this very juncture. Many readers of the Iliad are shocked to find that the Trojan War does not end within the tale, and the famous wooden horse doesn't even make an appearance. This tale was left to other stories, and is even mentioned several times in the Odyssey. Furthermore, there are several key events that happen after Hector dies that precede the sack of the city. After the events of the Iliad, the Trojans are boosted by the arrival of several allies. Penthesilea, the great Amazon queen, fought and died at the hands of Achilles, as did Memnon, the Ethiopian king. But fate eventually turned on Achilles, who was struck by a poisoned arrow from Paris's bow that landed, with Apollo's help, right in his vulnerable heel. Following this, the competition among the Greeks to inherit his divine armor also led to the untimely suicide of the greater Ajax, out of grief for his savage actions upon losing out to Odysseus. Eventually, the Greeks discovered that to win the war they needed Philoctetes, a companion of Heracles, as well as his legendary bow. Once they retrieved him, Philoctetes made an immediate impact, taking out Paris with an arrow of his own. After a few more side quests, spy missions, and various other shenanigans, Odysseus finally came up with a decisive plan, with Athena's inspiration, of course. So, the Greeks packed up and sailed off, leaving behind only a giant wooden horse as an offering to the gods. Or so the Trojans thought. Despite some internal dissension, the Trojans hauled the horse into the city and proceeded to celebrate their victory long into the night. Little did they know, of course, that the best Greek soldiers were hidden inside, and the rest of the Greek army was lying in wait nearby. And so that night, the Greeks slipped out of the horse, opened the gates, and the doom of Troy was full wrought. The sack of Troy was regarded by many Greeks across various times as a particularly horrible event for all concerned. None of the Greek heroes came out looking especially honorable either. The Trojans suffered horribly, their city destroyed, their men killed, and their women enslaved. Only a small band of Trojans under Aeneas survived, but the city was lost. Even Astyanax, the infant son of Hector, could not escape the savagery. He was thrown from the walls onto the rocks below. The cruel fate of the Trojan women later became the subject of the great tragedy of Euripides, around the same time that the Athenians were facing the reality of defeat in a war of their own. Nevertheless, the mission was accomplished, the city was destroyed, Helen was reunited with Menelaus, happily or otherwise, and the Greeks got to go home. So what could go wrong? Much of the aftermath of the Trojan War is told through the Odyssey, which you can hear in much greater detail in my introduction to the text. It tells not only of Odysseus' journey, but also fills us in on what happened to all the other heroes. Suffice it to say that the gods were already pretty annoyed at all the death and destruction of their people and temples in Troy, and the Greeks made things much worse by the savagery of their actions. Storms battered the fleet on their return home, and the heroes were separated from one another, none more so than Odysseus. Menelaus and Helen ended up in Egypt before eventually making it back home to Sparta, where they show up in Book 4 of the Odyssey. Agamemnon returned home to Mycenae to find that his wife's rage had simmered for too long. She killed him shortly after, trapping him in a net while in the bath and stabbing him to death. Her children, Orestes and Electra, then took revenge on her in turn, and Orestes was forever hounded by the Furies for the crime of matricide. A normal week in the life of the House of Atreus. The remaining heroes feature in small tales of their own for the most part, some meeting grisly fates and others living out their days in peace. Perhaps the most satisfying of these is Ajax the Lesser's death. After he savagely violated Cassandra in a temple sacred to Athena, the goddess destroyed his ship and the sea swallowed him whole. The most famous sequel to the Trojan War, apart from the Odyssey of course, is the Roman epic called the Aeneid, which traces the journey of the Trojan survivor Aeneas as he wanders around the Mediterranean in order to fulfill his destiny to found a new people who just so happen to turn out to be the Romans. It's a wonderful work, worth reading at some point, though it was made for a different time and a different audience, so it will have to wait for another day. So that, in a nutshell, is the course of the Trojan War. From lavish weddings and a divine beauty pageant to bitter conflicts and harrowing violence. With great heroes and villains, monsters and men, the saga of the Trojan War has it all. Eat your heart out, MCU. There's no wonder that it formed the great centerpiece of Greek mythology and spawned 100 offshoots, sequels, reboots and spin-offs. I hope the summary will be helpful for you to understand much of the context going into our reading of the Odyssey, and please let me know if there are any characters, events, or places that you'd like to know more about. Until next time, take care.